go. Wonderful, so that we don't, oh, there's a bit of mist, I feel, in my camera. It's not really clear. I'm gonna try to do my best to make sure that the image is clear enough. Kind of misty feeling. So wonderful. So welcome. I always confuse weeks, so I want to make sure that we are on the right week. This is week 4, if I'm not mistaken. So this is learning and conditioning. That's the topic for tonight. And even before we start talking about anything, let me just pull up Canvas, share my screen, and reshare the calendar with you, although you can find the calendar in the introductory module. So 3, 2, 1, let me share my screen. So that's where we are today, this one. So in order to avoid any confusion, I feel this is something that we could do every week and remind me if I forget. So the topic of tonight's class, so tonight's lecture is going to be on learning and conditioning, and it's referring to chapter 9. So that's the chapter in the textbook that you will need to study. Of course, the quiz that was due today was on the second part of chapter 4. So please, again, do not confuse what's in the parentheses. What's in parentheses always refer to the quiz. But what we talked about tonight will be on chapter 9. Now, you might wonder, the whole thing? Well, in terms of what you need to study for next week, for the next quiz, I'm only asking you to study about these pages here. Now, I do understand that there's quite a bit, so I will do my best to, as usual, describe appropriately what I want you to focus on during this lecture. 2 things. There will be a lot of memorization tonight, not because the terms are particularly challenging. It's definitely much, how can I say, it's definitely easier, a lot easier than the previous 2 weeks, because you don't have to remember, okay, which one is the hippocampus, which one is the frontal lobe, none of that. But it's just very confusing because there are a lot of words that for some reason make us read too much into it, terms such as stimulus and response. In general, this is one of such weeks where I dare to say, trust your guts and you most likely will be okay. All right, and we'll see what I mean by that. But before we venture into the content of the chapter, anything that any of you want to share about last week, the previous topics we discussed, anything that wasn't clear? And again, I still have a few quizzes to review, of course, because they're still open, and so I didn't grade fully grade every quiz, so I will not be able to share the answers to the quiz number 3. But anything regarding the previous lecture that wasn't clear? Oh, goody good. All right. Fantastic. Wonderful. So now it's interesting because this is the perfect week to start learning about learning. Now, some of you, asked me about certain studying strategies, and I will be more precise in my answers when we talk about memory and memorization processes, which is not this week. But since this chapter talks about learning, some of those techniques will make more sense once we master the topics that we will discuss tonight, right? For instance, if someone were to ask you, what is learning and what is conditioning, without taking a peek on the textbook, what would you answer to those 2 questions? What is learning for you? What is conditioning for you? To break the ice. Anybody? Please.
I would say learning for me is taking in, retaining information, and maybe using it to change my perspective on the way I'm doing things. And conditioning is maybe retaining that.
Okay. Yes.
Opposed to you change something you do one day, and then the next day you've forgotten and you've gone back to how you were before.
Yes, that's a pretty darn good answer, I would say, to use a medical term. Yes, you're spot on. You're spot on. Yes. Anybody else adding or agreeing?
Yeah, I thought learning was starting to retain, and then conditioning was just the habitual effects that that learning has on you.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty much spot on. So I assume that everybody agrees. Please nod if you have the monitor on, or give me a sign. All right. Oh, okay. Thank you, Hannah. To add on to conditioning, also to practice it. Yes, yes, absolutely. Thank you, Lydia. All right. So generally speaking, it's not a false assumption to think that learning and conditioning are very, very close, almost the same thing from a psychological perspective. Now, of course, you could argue, as you rightfully did, that conditioning carries on a habit creation process more than learning. But then the question remains, so what is learning but habit creation? Because you may say, did you really learn something if you cannot remember it or if you cannot use it in practice? And that's where the distinction will make more sense when we talk about the function and structure of different types of memory, because there will be significant differences whether you need to remember a fact, a biographical piece of memory. You need to remember how to do things, like you remember how to drive a car, to ride a bicycle, or you remember a connection between fact and biographical memory. For instance, you're able to recognize a person's face. So there will be differences, neurologically speaking, between these things. But tonight we will talk about what they all have in common. All right. Now, conditioning, to some extent, also means brainwashing in a good or bad way. This means that we as human beings can be conditioned to do things and to think about things because we had previous exposure, right? For instance, I want to actually, let me share this to make the point here. Give me 1 second. This is a very, very short clip that kind of proves the point. I'm not sure if I actually showed it to you before. Did I show you the little clip from The Office, the comedy show? No. Okay, good. So it's a super quick thing to show you. Let me just make sure that I have the right clip.
Without grammar,
sorry, there's always a commercial. This is like 30 seconds clip just to make the point, and I will continue. Okay, I think I'm ready to share my screen. All right, 1, 2, 3, and I'll try to use my audio. Hopefully it will work. And if not,
reboot again.
wait with me.
Okay, do you want to what? One alpha. Okay. Alpha. Sure. What are you doing? What? I don't know. My mouth is so bad all of a sudden.
All right. So that's, in short, conditioning. It's pretty much a repetition that makes you believe something in a partial or total absence of awareness.
Are
Okay.
you finished? Well, thank you. How thoughtful.
Oh,
Would you like a chocolate?
I guess that's me. My apologies.
Um,
Sorry, kept it running. I thought it was some of you. So anyway, the idea is this. You are exposed to an action, to a behavior, to a fact, to an image. And this is exposure in space and time. Okay. And because you are starting to pair two different things, which we'll refer to as stimulus and response eventually. But the idea is that this becomes part of your thought process. Okay. So in this example that the abstract from the office, from the comedy show, the idea is that a person starts to have a cognitive explanation. Okay, I'm offering you whatever, candy or mint, whatever. But then before I realize it, I associate that action with something else. In this specific example, you have either audio visual stimulus, and that was, I think, the Windows, whatever, 98 or Windows 10, ringtone, whatever you want to call it. And so once you hear that, you have this automatic response. Now, this specific clip might be a little extreme in the way we work. In a sense, we are not that brainwashable, I guess, but it definitely strikes the point. Now, so let's begin, and I will share one of the images that I already uploaded on this module. And this will be an image of, I'm going to type it on the chat here, classical conditioning. It's a bit called classical because it was the very first one to be precisely discussed and analyzed by Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian physiologist. He was not a psychologist or neuroscientist. He was interested in studying the digestive process in mammals. Okay, so he discovered classical conditioning by scientific chance, if there was ever such thing. So let me share the picture, the image that I uploaded on this module, so that we are on the same page. And this image mimics what you find in the textbook, but rather than me, holding on the textbook to you, I feel it's better for me to just share that image. So this will be the image called classical conditioning number 2 on your canvas. So let me see if I can do this. Right here, perfect. All right, so I will share my screen. If not, feel free to just open that picture on your what am I doing here? On your monitor. So as you can see here, don't you worry about the small print. I will read to you, and what I want you to do is just to see the dog. Okay, I hope you can all see the dog for now, right? So what you can see is a dog observing something. The dog doesn't exist. Now, in the first quadrant right here, this is what happens before conditioning. Okay, there is a dog and there is a bowl with food. Okay. Now, what's happening here? Well, a little bigger. What's happening is that the dog, you would assume, likes the food. That's, of course, only works if that is the case. And the dog starts to salivate. So that's really what Pavlov was studying, just the first quadrant, okay? Seeing how the dog's digestive tract will respond to food, okay? Now, at this point, don't you worry about anything else that's written there. Just look at the dog and think of a dog salivating. Now, in the second example, you have a whistle and there is a dog. Let's assume that you blow the whistle. The dog doesn't have any specific response related to food. So in other words, in the second quadrant, the dog does not salivate because the dog does not usually associate blowing a whistle with eating, okay? The same way as we usually don't associate a specific auditory stimulation with eating in general. But what would happen third quadrant during conditioning? What would happen if we present the dog at the same time with the food while blowing the whistle? Now, those two things are not related whatsoever. It's not that the whistle has a shape of a fork or something that someone might use to eat, completely separate. At this point, however, if you do this enough times, every time you bring the dog food, you blow the whistle, then the whistle itself becomes the conditioned stimulus. At some point, you'll be able to just remove the food and you just blow the whistle and the dog will come to you already start to salivate. All right. So conditioning is just this. You have something that makes sense. You associate something with something that doesn't necessarily make the same sense or doesn't necessarily require the same response. But if you present these two things long enough, then you'll be able to stimulate the sense that you would otherwise have in the first example. Okay. Now, the example that the textbook provides actually will be on page 309. All right. And they took a step back. So I'm going to show you the picture on 309. Instead of having the whistle and the food, they have an empty bowl and the food here. Okay. This makes sense too. But the reason why I want to use this specific image on Canvas is because it works even though the whistle has nothing to do with food. Because you might say, well, of course the dog will salivate if you see an empty bowl because the bowl reminds the dog of food, but the whistle certainly does not do that. In fact, just FYI, in the original experiment, Pavlov did not even have a whistle. He had just an electric bulb that he just turned on, and eventually the bulb was replaced by an auditory stimulus. Okay, so it's something visual at first. So every time the bulb was going on, there was a different type of light, and the dog will associate that with the food. Okay, so again, let me stop sharing for a second. So that classic condition is pretty much this. Let's assume I have this cup of water, this glass of water. Okay, and I don't know. Let's assume that I'm clumsy. Let's assume, right? Every time I try to reach, to grab my cup of water, by mistake, I hit my marker and the marker makes this noise. Slightly before, maybe a millisecond before I grab my cup of water. Now, every time I hear this noise, I immediately associate this noise with the fact that I'm about to drink, okay? So this process, simply enough, it's called pairing because you pair two different things, okay? Now, the process of associating these two is called pairing, but what happens as a result of pairing is called conditioning, okay? I am conditioned to feel, believe, think, act as a result of associating these two things. Now, a few terms now. Everything is okay for now, right? Oh, wait a second. I just read your comment, Kat, like Pavlov's dog, but human. Yes, sorry. I'm a little low. I'm a little slow in my conditional response. Let me put it this way. So this is very confusing because the terms are very similar. So this is one of the chapters in which I'm going to ask you to do this. Read this on the side, then ignore it and just look at the pictures. Okay, this is one of such chapters where I should give the recommendation, you should read books, but if you could read comic books instead, that would be better for you. So just have a specific image or just draw your own, all right? So let me use the textbook as a reference. So I will cover all the descriptors in the sequence that are presented, but I will use this as an example. So what is an unconditioned stimulus? US, okay? USA. What is an unconditioned stimulus? It's something that is stimulating, but is unconditioned. So for instance, what would you consider in this? Let me see if I can put it up here. What would you consider this? Come on. In this quadrant. The US is just food. In my case, it's just water. Well, the fact that stimulus is kind of of course, it's stimulating my thirst or it's stimulating my hunger. And it's unconditioned simply because nothing happened to it. It's naturally stimulating, all right? So food makes you hungry because it's food. Now, of course, you may say, well, what if I just ate? Sure, but the ontological element doesn't change. It's still food. That's what food is for, okay? And now, of course, you may say, well, if I don't like that specific food? Sure, there are different levels of interpretation, but if you just stick to water, whether you like it or not, if you're in the middle of the desert and you haven't, drunk in days, and someone presents you with water, you will not, argue about the taste of it. You will feel thirsty, okay? So again, it's a stimulus because it stimulates something, and it's unconditioned because it just is what it is, period. So every time you see US, always think of unconditioned stimulus. Unfortunately, in most quizzes in psychology, they use the acronyms, which are even more confusing, okay? In the quiz, I did my best to spell it out and ask you what is an unconditioned, what is a conditioned stimulus, what is a response. But if you ever want to become a psychologist, just get used to these acronyms. And again, they're pretty self-explanatory, but once you start to see US, UR, CR, CS, that can get confusing. So just take a breath and you'll be fine. All right, so the first thing, US is the unconditioned stimulus. What is my thirst? What is my salivating response? Well, that is also unconditioned. It's just natural, but it is a response. So we will call that unconditioned response, UR. Okay. In the textbook, US is the food and the salivating dog, it's called UR. Okay. So at the level of classical conditioning, you can also rule things are. So if you don't remember the acronym, you say, well, it cannot be, if you just say UR, okay, I don't remember what that is. It cannot be unconditioned stimulus because there's no S there. It cannot be a neutral stimulus because there's no N. Therefore, it has to be an unconditional response. You can just rule things out, okay? Because for instance, in a quiz, you might find, please define which of the following items is the unconditional response: the food, the bowl, the whistle, or the salivating dog. And you have to rule things out, okay? So you can already rule out both food and the whistle because they're not responding to anything. So they're not responses. So at this point, you really have conditioned response or unconditional response. And salivation in itself is a normal response to food. So here you have it, unconditioned response. So I would almost like to say to you that a good way to remember unconditioned is just think of it as, where's my equal sign? As normal. So unconditioned stimulus is a normal stimulus. Unconditional response is a normal response, except that some students mentioned to me that this is confusing because natural sounds a lot like neutral. And of course, neutral is not natural, okay? So I leave it up to you to decide how you want to study this. So you might, okay, so what is neutral in conditioning? What is a neutral stimulus? Well, something that is not, doesn't make sense yet. A neutral stimulus is the bowl, for instance, the bowl for food. Sure, you might say, if you see a bowl, what else are you gonna use the bowl for, okay? Or a cup, what else would you use the cup but to, pour some, some water in it? But that's because you've been conditioned long enough, right? But there will be a time in your life, maybe when you're a 3-year-old, where you did not associate these two things yet. There had been a time maybe where any items was just a throwing object before anything else, okay? So again, US, unconditioned stimulus, food, water. UR, unconditional response, such as thirst, hunger, salivation. NS, neutral stimulus, the container, the cup, the bowl. In your textbook, you have the bowl, okay? To give you an example. So this will be one of the example. Now we might, so is the whistle in the previous example you mentioned also a neutral stimulus? Sure, because it doesn't do anything for that specific thing. Okay. Now notice, I would not make the claim if the whistle was utilized if you're playing rugby or football, okay? Because that's what the whistle is for in that context. But if you're eating, usually you don't associate that with food. Only after conditioning, you will associate it with food. So anything is neutral if it has not been serving any specific purpose. Does that make sense so far? Okay. Sorry, I'm going very slow because the terms are pretty easy, and yet it can be confusing to me sometimes too. I studied this for like 20 years, and when I did my boards, the exam to become a licensed psychologist, for a second, whoa, hold on a second here. I should know this, but I knew just to calm down because it just gets confusing. Okay. All right. Now, I would say that as far as classical conditioning, this is 80% of everything you need to know about this chapter. But sorry, there's a background noise. My son decided to play ringtones on the piano. This is Twitter or Skype. I'm sorry about that. Unconditioned stimulus, by the way, perfect example. Not distracting at all. So what about more stimuli? Because you might say, okay, well, I do understand this automatic response, but can you tell us a little bit about business psychology? How can we so easily brainwashed by media, by social media, by the advertisement industry, for instance? Just think about it. You want to sell a Coke, not something you snort, something you drink. Full disclosure, okay? You not saying anything here, not suggesting anything. So you want to sell, Coca-Cola, okay? And the whole commercial is about, fancy cars and 10 people on the beach. There's nothing there that even remotely suggests drinking. Well, it's the beach, it's hot, therefore, you're more thirsty. Okay. How about showing a successful businessman in Wall Street, and you just show this, let's say it's a middle-aged man in a tuxedo, clear cut, and you want to sell a BMW. What has a car to do? He's in the office inside. How can you sell that? Well, the idea is that you need to complete different pairing modalities to lead your thought to associate, for instance, the concept of success, strength, and whatever alpha male behavior in Wall Street to another item that might be in itself eventually paired long enough to be also associated with success and alpha male behavior, despite the fact that you could make the opposite case. Well, if you buy yourself a fancy car, you will lose money, you will not gain money, okay? And then you want to appear as successfully of a business owner as you possibly can. Or let me give you another example. You use children in any commercial, despite the commercial might have to do with signing you up for a new credit card. That sounds very immoral, capitalistic. Please leave my kids alone. And yet, kids are irresistible. Well, if they're not your own, and then otherwise they become more tricky. Forget what I just said. Bad dad. But the hardest job you ever love, right? But in any case, you get the idea. You can be pushed so far to know rationally something doesn't make sense, and yet you're prone to fall for that. That's the idea. And it's called higher order conditioning. And this is on page 310. So let me just stop it here. Higher order conditioning. Okay. So example, it's on the bottom of the page here. Okay. There's three images here. So what you can see here, it's always our dear dog, but this time what's happening here is exactly what I discussed earlier about the electric bulb. So the items are the same. You have a dog in all three cases, of course. Then you have the bowl, and then you have another stimulus here, okay? An electric bulb, okay? Now, what's the deal here? Let's start from the first thing. Let's assume that we did our job. So if you look at the chat, now you have three terms: US, UR, and S. All right. So let's try to do this together to better, memorize. What is an unconditioned stimulus? Something that is naturally stimulating, right? So if you think about a salivating dog, what would be a US? Any of you? You can pick in your book, but food. Yeah. All right. What would be an unconditional response to food?
Salivating.
Salivating. Fantastic. Now, what is an S at this point? Take a look at the book.
Oh, that would be the bowl or whatever container the
Yes.
food's in.
All right, fantastic. So we got
Or maybe
this.
utensils.
Oh, utensils. Perfect. Fantastic. Okay. Now, at this point, once you put the bowl together with the food long enough, what will the bowl become at this point? You pair the bowl with food long enough.
It'll be a conditional stimulus. Wouldn't it?
Yes, fantastic. All right, so that's the first image, okay? So a conditioned bowl, it's a conditioned stimulus, okay? Now, there will be more discussion that are warranted in this context because there's a whole branch of psychology studies, semantic ergonomics, that have to do with the claim that certain shapes are naturally eliciting a response. To give an example, there's a whole branch of Freudian psychoanalysis that claims that anything that is, my apologies in advance, anything that is phallic in their structure is in itself stimulating a intercourse type of thought. I tend to disagree with this. I think Freud was very conflicted as a person, but if we remove the sexual component and we think about penetration simply as an act, not a sexual act, penetration as a device entering another one, thinking about an electric plug, for instance, then in that sense, convex and concave make sense. Something that is shaped like this, for instance. It doesn't have to be anything sexual, but this shape is in itself conditioning for this shape because they match. So in this sense, there's a whole branch of psychology that, well, even if you didn't pair this together, it's a natural response we have as human beings to see something that has the opposite shape as this one as complementary. Does that make sense? So in the context of a cup, you want to say, well, it's because as a child, eventually someone poured the water in it. But if you see that there's a container, then your brain races to think, okay, this is something that contains something, all right? For instance, even if you let me just grab a piece of paper here. A piece of paper like this might not do anything to you, but if I put a piece of paper like this, okay, at this point, this already gives me the brain the idea, okay, maybe I can put something in it. It's a cone, okay? So there is something about this whole conditioning thing that might be innate, neurologically speaking, but we'll talk about that in the next few weeks. So for now, focus on CS. So CS is a stimulus that became conditioned, so a bowl. So what will happen to the dog with this bowl? Well, at this point, the dog might start to salivate, even though the bowl might be still empty. Okay, does that make sense so far? Right? Okay, good. So if the dog is salivating, what type of thing is the salivating dog at that point? So rule things out. So the salivation cannot be a stimulus in itself. I mean, it can be a stimulus of disgust, but not in this context. In reaction to the bowl, since it's a reaction, is a response, right? Does that make sense? So we already have an R. So I'm going to type the R for now. Okay. What type of response? Since it's a response to a conditioned stimulus. It can no longer be an unconditioned response because the stimulus is conditioned. Therefore, yes, it's a condition response, right? All right. Phase one. So far, we covered this one. Okay. Now, okay, you might say, I am a mad scientist. I got this. I wonder if I can get the dog to salivate. And I can do this by, again, pairing something with something else. So at this point, you have the bowl. And in the book, you have an electric bulb. So electric bulb. All right. So what is the electric bulb? How would you find it? Keep in mind, you have an unconditioned stimulus, you have the bowl, and then you have the light, you have the electric bulb. Well, first thing first, it's not a response, right? It's a bowl, so it has to be something containing a type of S, right? Okay, right on, yes. It is a neutral stimulus. Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. It's neutral because it's neither or. This is a time of etymology for all of you. The term neutral comes from the Latin neuter, which was an Indo-European word, and in English became neither. And in itself came from uterus. Why uterus? Because uterus in the pagan alchemic tradition was the place where a person, well, biological female subject, of course, could produce either a boy or a girl. Okay, so this binary possibility, biologically speaking, give the option of neutral. In this context, it's perfect, because it's neither conditioned nor unconditioned yet. It's neutral. It just exists. Okay. It's neutral to this specific though situation, right? Because you could say it's not a neutral stimulus if all you're thinking about is turning the light on because you're in complete darkness. It's simply neutral to the food. Does that make sense? So what's happening here? Now you have a neutral stimulus plus, where's the plus? Here. You have a conditioned stimulus, okay? Neutral stimulus plus conditioned stimulus, so two stimuli, right? And what are you going to get with these two? Well, the conditioned stimulus swallows in its conditioning capacity the neutral one, so you'll have a conditioned response. Does that make sense? Conditioned response. Right here. All right. At this point, because you are the mad scientist you represent yourself to be, you're also cynical, and you not only don't give the food to the dog, but you also remove the bowl. You just leave the dog alone with the electric bulb, and the CR will be still there, because once the response is conditioned, stays conditioned, not forever, we'll see, that's not true, but for the time being stays conditioned, but the bulb, it's no longer a neutral stimulus because it became conditioned. Therefore, the bulb becomes a conditioned stimulus. All right. And you can do this forever. So you could say, okay, first you go to a fancy restaurant and then you order whatever. You only order a salad because that's how much money you have that night. So you, after that, you have the person is serving you a nice, so it's sort of a nice salad in a nice bowl. Then you start to associate that bowl. So you buy yourself a bowl at Big Lots. And then every time you see the bowl, you be reminded of that experience. And then you put the bowl right next to, I don't know, a silver plate fork, because you can afford a real silver one. So you have that one, and then you remove the bowl, and then the fork itself makes you feel good. Then you remove the fork, and you can put, I don't know, a napkin. And then you remove the napkin and you put, I don't know, a colorful candy instead of that. And you can on and on until you might have a book reminding you of the fancy place you ate. And that's higher order conditioning. There's no limit to how long this chain is going to be, okay? But of course, you had to be present, you had to be constantly stimulated. So for instance, think about branding. Sorry for the background noise there. Thinking about branding, think about logos such as Nike, okay? The little, I don't know how to define it, the circumflex, whatever, mark, check mark. Now, this works because we as society, we've been exposed enough to the term, to the word, to the brand Nike, and underneath that, there was this mark, for instance, or think about Amazon, right? With the little, smiling thing. Now, at some point, you don't even have to mention the name of the company anymore because the sign, the logo might be enough, okay? Now, notice this is different from other types of brands that have the logo that mimics the font of the word. There's no indication of the word whatsoever, to the point that you can even remove, in a higher order conditioning, both logo, sign, and word, and you can just use a sentence. Just do it in the context of Nike, for instance, okay? And at that point, even though you're not talking about sports, footwear, or anything, every time you say that sentence or hear the sentence, for a second, you might think of that brand, okay? Thinking about a sentence such as, I'm loving it. Even if you're vegan, most of the time you might think of that horrible food industry, fast food company, okay? And that's how the brain works. Now, this should give you some sense of control of the process, and some paranoid traits that Big Brother is watching us and makes us think whatever they want us to. But hey, there is a way out of that. And one way out is recognition. Once you realize that the process occurs, the process becomes less and less strong. So once you realize that you've been conditioned, you're less conditionable. And two, if you stay away from the stimulus long enough, these will be less and less powerful. Now, this is in itself one of the fundamental strategies in addiction recovery. At some point, your behavior has been conditioned, has been paired. Your drinking, your smoking, your whatever it is, has been paired, okay? And that's why it does not make sense to say to a person who struggles with drug addiction, for instance, well, you should really stop taking drugs. But don't you think I know that? But I've been conditioned. It's not something that you need to rationalize about it, okay? So you need to remove that link. You need to decondition what was previously conditioned, okay? All right, how to do that? So let's move on, and I'm still following the textbook here, okay? Now, one of the things that I want you to think about is, let me see if I can find the discrimination. Where did I put it here? Oh, that was a previous page. Sorry, it was in the previous page. So 309. They don't give you a picture. There's just a description here. Extinction and spontaneous recovery. These two terms, page 309. So I'm just going to read it to you. Extinction, the weakening and eventual disappearance of a learned response. And by learned, we mean conditioned response. Okay? In classical conditioning, it occurs when the conditioned stimulus, for instance, the electric bulb or the drink, okay, or the drug, when this conditioned stimulus is no longer paired with the unconditioned stimulus, okay? When they're no longer paired, where, for instance, thinking about the commercial advertising industry, your high alcohol content drink, it's no longer paired with, I don't know, an emotional state of mind. It's no longer paired with feeling happier, feeling more less inhibited, having a better grasp on coping mechanism. Once you separate those two things, it becomes less powerful, okay? Think about a fancy pair of shoes. Once you remove the idea of the shoes carrying some sort of amulet-like power to attract people to you, then the shoes will become what they are meant to do, shoes. Okay. Spontaneous recovery, the other term, the reappearance of a learned response after its apparent extinction. And again, this is the tricky thing with addiction, drugs and alcohol and any addiction. It's hard to determine how long things have to be separated, have to be kept separated so that they not keep conditioning one another. It's hard to know because we are different. For some people, 24 hours is more than enough. For some people, 6 months might be enough. For some people, it's a constant work. But the idea is this: something has been magnetized in your brain. Something has been conditioned in your brain. You need to demagnetize that. All right. And the tricky thing is that, and most of you will know this, when things appear to be all good at first, it's a usual indication that you're not ready. I want to give an example, that's nothing to do with salivating dogs or drugs and alcohol misuse, but something about relationships. Let's assume that let's assume you've been heartbroken and you forgot everything about your partner. Yeah, I can see them, downtown. I have no effect. I got this. Yeah, no effect. The moment you see that, everything falls apart. And you really thought you got this. It's not that you were in denial or you were, gullible or naive. You really thought that, yes, no emotions. Yeah, I wish them well, as Adele would sing about. You really thought it was gone, and yet it was an apparent extinction. And so part of that is retraining yourself. All right. And so it takes a long process, but in this sense, neurologically speaking, time heals. All right. So the more you stay away, the better it is, but there will be some bumps along the road where you had to keep reinforcing yourself. So in other words, you will have to do things despite the fact that they will not make sense to you. Okay. In the case of the partner that you've been dating before, you just need to tell yourself, doesn't matter what I feel, I will not listen to that part of myself, because that part of myself is conditioned. And that's kind of the area where you need to find yourself in. Sure, I will always encourage you to trust your guts, to use your emotional intelligence, but your emotions themselves can be conditioned. Okay, just to think about, you see a beautiful human specimen, and you tell your friend, well, they're so gorgeous, pretty beautiful, and your best friend next to you is, really? I don't think so. And yet you fall in love. And thankfully you do, because otherwise we'll all fall in love with the same person, which will not be particularly pleasant. But in any case, you can be conditioned. Your emotion can be conditioned. All right. Now, let me do two things now before. Oh, actually, let me read the. All right, there's a message. And I'm gonna mention who asked that. But would it be the same as replacing drinking with like exercise, or would it be something else? No, that's precisely it. That's precisely it. In general, the stronger the stimulus, the better it is. Let me see what I mean by that, because that's exactly what I'm about to discuss now. Because the question is, all right, let me assume there are two behaviors, one bad, one good, okay? Let's assume that particularly for me, drinking is bad. Drinking alcohol is bad because things fall apart when I do it. But maybe I'm not going to use exercise. I'm going to use something you can do while drinking. Okay. So I know drinking is bad, but having the salad that we just mentioned, that's healthy. That's good for me. Okay. So every time I want to have a drink, for now, I want to make sure to pair the drink with the salad. At some point, I hope to get rid of the drink and just keep the salad. Okay. That's the idea. But how would you know that the salad will take over the drink and so the drink will take over the salad? So each time you want to have a salad, then you want to have a fix in terms of drinking. And let's see how that happens. So the next part of the chapter talks about that, and talks about the creation of fear, page 314. I'm skipping a few things because those are the things that I will really ask you in the quiz, okay? Because there are a lot of extra description, a lot of extra diagrams, extinction trial, acquisition trials. You can read it, but it will not ask you about that. So on page 314, you have what I think it's the best description of psychological sciences: a crying baby with a hammer. We are horrible human beings. Okay, just for full disclosure here, okay? So, you know, here you have a psychologist, got a PhD from Harvard. What would you like to do in your life? Well, I want to see what happens if I use a hammer against a child. Yes, because I want to do some extra peer-reviewed science. All right, the creation of fear. The hammer in this context is an unconditioned stimulus. Why? Because the child at first does not necessarily know what the hammer is for. Now, usually everything needs hammering. If you have a hammer, it's still true. But at this point, the child might be, in this case, simply scared because maybe there was something before that made the response more natural. And in fact, the response is unconditioned. Okay, maybe, I don't know, it's sound, the pounding sound of the hammer, and that kind of startles the child, and the child starts to cry. Normal. Okay, even adults, even if you're working, you know, as a you know, at Home Depot, for instance, you might be startled by a loud noise. So anyway, you have the child crying. And yet you work from home and you are a carpenter and you use hammering a lot. It's part of what you're doing. And you also babysit your own child. You're such a good person. And so you want to do something so that the child will not develop PTSD as a result of your job. And so you want, how can I do something with, you know, with this? I want to make sure that the hammer will be perceived in a better light. Okay, that's the idea. But hold on one second. What if before I do that, because I'm still that very perverted psychologist, I want to make the child cry even more? Can I make this happen? And I'm sorry for being so cynical tonight, but I just want to magnify what's happening here so that by creating a caricature of the experiment, maybe you'll remember better. So can I get a neutral stimulus? Now, in this example, they use a mouse. And of course, for some people, mice can be very cute. And for some people, it may be very scary. So use another type of animal to think of it. Think of a hare, a rabbit. Think of a cute hamster, something like that. Okay. Think of a hamster. Okay. They stink like no tomorrow, but are cute. So hamster. Okay. Let's assume it's a hamster. The hamster is a neutral stimulus. Okay. Neither or. Now you pair the hamster with a hammer that already makes the child cry. Now you create fear. Every time the child sees the hamster, the child will start to cry. Okay. Oh boy. No wonder psychologists are the ones that need help the most. Anyway, so this is the creation of fear, right? Pretty straightforward. Now, most PTSD works like that, by the way, including complex PTSD. Think of it. I hope I'm not triggering anybody after everything I've done tonight, but if you had a bad experience in your life, whether you were bullied or abused or violated, there's a lot, there are many elements about that situation that might be triggering. It might be a smell, might be a piece of clothing, might be a situation, a place, might be a car. There's a lot of things that are in themselves conditioned, okay? Now, I'm not going to mention anything too traumatic to make the point, but let's go back to the bad experience you had with your previous partner that broke your heart, okay? For the time being, it will be hard to go visit the same places that you visit with this person because those places will remind you of that person. The place itself is beautiful, but you cannot figure out a way to separate those two things, okay? And that's a condition. It's not creation of fear, but it's a creation of sadness in the very least, okay? Now, so you got the idea. You can have this higher order conditioning to do good and to do bad, all right? terms are the same, right? Unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. Okay. All right. But what if we want to do good in the world? What we want to be moral beings? Well, counter conditioning is what's supposed to happen. Counter conditioning. Now, the term counter conditioning does not retain any ethical or moral value. It's simply going against what you previously done. So if you create a fear, counter conditioning of fear means removing fear. But if you condition a good response, counter conditioning will be doing the opposite, creating a bad response. Okay, so simply counter means just going against. Now, I feel that the example that the books provides is pretty good. You have milk and cookies. Can be soy milk and can be gluten-free cookies, whatever works for you, something good, okay? And there is an unconditioned stimulus, as usual, okay? And the unconditional response is the child is happy, okay? The assumption here is that in general, milk and cookies are good enough for the vast majority of children, so that hopefully they will elicit a good response, okay? My wife cannot stand milk. I don't know why. Still trying to figure out as a psychologist. So this will not be applicable to her. But in general, milk and cookies, pretty good combo for children. Now, let's assume that, contrary to the previous example, there's a nice rabbit or hare here, but the child is scared, okay? I don't know. It's just something that the child is afraid of. Just because I share everything on my private life, this will be my wife with cats. So the rabbit, I will not quiz you on that. The rabbit is a conditioned stimulus because the child somewhere at some point started to be afraid of the hare, of the rabbit. Okay, so it's already conditioned. Okay, and of course, the child crying is a conditioned response. No problem whatsoever. So what are you gonna do? Well, I know at least two things about reality. You know, I think, therefore I am. I know that at least the child is happy with milk and cookies and really not happy with the rabbit. Okay, so I wonder what would happen if I put them together. What happens here in this example is that the rabbit becomes conditioned and becomes a good condition. So it becomes a positive conditioned stimulus so that the child now is happy. Okay. Now, this is a new conditional response because before, the child was not happy, okay? So still conditional response, but good conditioning, new conditional response, okay? Now, one of the things that, so let me read the cap here, the description. Counter conditioning of fear. 3-year-old Peter, I guess that's his name, had acquired a conditioned fear of rabbits. To counter the condition of this fear, the researchers paired a rabbit, the conditioned stimulus, with a snack of milk and crackers. Oh, crackers, not cookies. Oh, that's disappointing. Which produced feelings of pleasure that were incompatible with the conditional response of fear. Eventually, Peter felt as comfortable with the rabbit as with the crackers. Now, so you got the gist of it, right? Question, is this exposure therapy in a sense? Yes, spot on. This is exposure therapy. Yes, expose yourself to something that will elicit that type of response you want to see. So this concludes the conversation, and we switch gears, we move to operant conditioning, and it will be done for tonight. You might ask, but how do you know that? How do you know that this was going to happen? You know, but what if the child will start to hate milk and cookies as well, and then you don't know what to do for breakfast tomorrow? The general rule of thumb, and it's only a rule of thumb, most studies clearly indicate that, is that the stronger the stimulus, the better. But careful, by stronger, we don't necessarily mean stronger, period. Stronger in its ability to make you feel better in the first place. So you have to ask yourself this question: what's higher in power? The goodness of cookies or the badness of the rabbit in this situation? So the pleasure that I got overrides the nasty emotion I get from that thing. And this is really tricky because in addiction, and I want to give you an example that is spot on. Think about alcohol addiction. Okay. If you ever struggle with that, you probably went through different stages. You might have some more or less intense withdrawal symptoms, but at some point, I'm pretty sure you had some sense of either nausea or vomiting if you did that at some point. Okay. Yep. So we already took care of the rational part. You don't drink because you believe it's good for you. You got this. You don't have to, tell me 1,000 times. Okay, it's not going to help. Don't moralize me. And yet, why do you still drink if you feel so horrible afterwards? That is a feeling. It's you. It's not someone telling you what to do. Well, this is one of the counter conditioning situation where the pleasure you got from, in this situation, alcohol, is stronger than the nausea you get as a result of the side effect. Okay, it's a physical thing, not a rational cognitive thing. So what to do about it? Well, there are different strategies. One is simply doing what we just said, staying away from that specific stimulus until you have enough strength to witness this extinction. But the other thing is, depending where you're coming from, keep doing this higher order conditioning. For instance, every time you drink, you associate that with a nasty smell. And by nasty, I really mean something is extremely bad to the point of being perceived by your brain as dangerous. Smell of feces, for instance. Okay. So you start to pair something that's very pleasurable with something that you cannot possibly associate that with. So every time you smell alcohol, you identify that with feces, for instance. Now, of course, this doesn't always work because you might be in a transition period where everybody else smell disgusts you, but not your own. This is a classical example with smoking. You can smoke, but you detest the smell of smoke if you enter a room where everybody's smoking. But you're totally fine if you're the one smoking a cigarette. Okay, so there will be a time where you need to put this, in perspective, allow time to unfold. So you can start with two different elements. So this is kind of a dualist perspective. Either you make the stuff that's bad for you but feels good bad, so good drink paired with bad smell, or the opposite, you associate something pleasurable to the absence of the stimulus. So this would be exercise, for instance, or smelling something nice. Every time we have a craving for alcohol, you smell something, aromatherapy, for instance. So you associate that first as the thing that will lead you to be away from the bottle for the next 60 minutes, and then for 120 minutes, and for one day, and so on and so forth. But it has to be something pleasurable, okay? Any question at this point? All good? Perfect. Now, so this is classical conditioning. There is another example on Canvas that's more detailed. So it's classical conditioning 2. Classical conditioning 1. Let me share my screen again. And those are just examples, okay? It's everything we just said, but in one single image, one single slide with all the acronyms, UR, CS, yes, US, okay? And then what happens after training? Now, this has to do with dogtrainingexcellence.com. But I really like it because the idea is super simple. A uses a dog the same way as Pavlov uses a dog. But then the idea is repetition, okay? Neutral signals, unconditional signal, unconditional response, conditional signal, conditional response, with different examples, different senses, okay? The phone rings, you're opening the dog food bag, someone yells fire in the hall, etc., etc. So this is another thing that I encourage you to just take a look. If you get everything from the textbook, don't even worry about these images, just use the one from the textbook, okay? As long as you remember the, US, UR, CS. Wonderful. Now, the second type of conditioning, we're in perfect time now, It's called operant conditioning. So we switch gears, operant conditioning, and you can view the relation between classical conditioning and operant conditioning in two different ways. One is just time and complexity. Classical conditioning came first, just historically came first, and it's also simpler because it's something that, aside from the label, you can get, like, sure, I was hungry, I want to eat, I'm thirsty, I want to drink. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, the fact that we have responses, it's a normal thing. Operant conditioning, it's different in a sense that you play a part in it. You're not completely deprived from free will. You never are, but it feels like that in classical conditioning. Okay, in operant conditioning, there is some level of agency, some level of control. Now, what does the book say about operant conditioning? Page 317. The book says, operant conditioning, the process by which a response becomes more likely to occur or less so, depending on its consequences. Very, very different. Okay, the child did not cry because the child was actually thinking about the possible negative consequence of seeing a hammer. It was the hammer itself that was previously conditioned. In operant conditioning, you're planning ahead. Okay. Now, rather than thinking about the comparison here, I want to say these things. Rather than thinking of stimulus and response, in operant conditioning, think of reinforcement or reinforcing. Okay. Now, I will use the same example that you have in the textbook, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. Let's assume that you have the situation, you're in college, you're studying, you got quizzes and you got grades, right? Let's assume that your first grade was a C+, okay? Technically a passing grade, but you might be disappointed because you put a lot of work in that, okay? So what is that? Well, like it or not, you will have some sort of psychological process in that regard. So let's assume, okay, that you decide to interpret that as, it's my fault, I should have studied more. Okay. Now, with studying more means a lot of things. Might mean that you get to spend less time with your children, you don't get to go out and party, you forfeit the opportunity to go to a concert. Concert, you used to remember those before COVID? Anyway, you had to compromise, okay? You do all the things, you study more, and you sacrifice things you like to do. And then the next week arrives and you got a full A, all right? You're very proud. Now, on page 319, you have this very example here. It's an A+. But the question remains, why do you think you got an A+? Has it to do more with stuff you added? You added more studying, or stuff you removed? You removed distractions. What got you there in the first place? Was something you did more or something you did less? And that's operant conditioning in its entirety. So let's start for the first example here. A+ is a positive reinforcer, okay? Makes you feel good, okay? Because you got an A+, the result is that you study more because you like to repeat that. It feels good, okay? Now, what would happen if instead let me put it this way. Let me start from this. Let me start from studying so that we focus on the textbook relative. So you start from here. You study, okay? You have two different types of reinforcer. One is positive because you add a new grade, a new good grade, and therefore you study more. Another one right here, it's negative. Someone nags you. You gotta study more. You gotta study more. In both cases, positive and negative, you end up studying more. Okay. Pretty straightforward. You might say that at this point, it's a question of differences in people. Some of us need more direction. Some of us need more deadlines. Some of us need to feel the full responsibility and guilt trip if you don't do something right. For some of us, we're kind of self-managed, and just the result will be sufficient to push us. It's just a question of differences, okay? Not ethical or moral. But the idea is that conditioning in this context is about making sure that a certain behavior will increase or decrease, okay? Let's say I want to increase my study hours, and I want to decrease my drinking and smoking with my friends hours. Look at the example here, the dog. The dog is waiting and waving at you. You give the dog food. What happens is that the responses become more likely. Every time the dog wails its tail, you give them a treat, and the fact that they're happy in that with the tail becomes more likely. So the behavior increases, okay? Other example here, page 319 again. You start from behavior, the same one, you're still studying. Now, in this case, rather than thinking of positive and negative reinforcement, you think of positive and negative punishment. Example, positive punishment. You study more, you're being ridiculed by friends. Well, you're wasting your time, you're young. Don't waste your time studying, hang out with us, okay? Result, study decreases. Negative punishment, loss of time with friends. Result, studying decreases. So what I'm trying to say here is that you can obtain the same behavior coming from two different angles, or the opposite of the behavior coming from two different angles. Now, this might be a little tricky at first, so let me give you an example. You are speeding downtown with your car. The speed limit is 25, you're driving 35. The police stops you and gives you a ticket. Why would the police stop you and give you a ticket? It's a free country. Why would they stop you and give you a ticket? Well, the idea is that they give you a ticket so that your speeding behavior will decrease, right? So that you'll be more prone to slow down. How do they do that? They add something, the ticket, but it also removes something, the money you have to spend in order to pay the ticket. But the result is the same. So with operant conditioning, you can interpret that from two different angles, okay? Now, when we think about reinforcing and punishing, don't think of that in a moral sense, okay? Don't think of punishing as a negative thing, because you have positive and negative punishment and positive and negative reinforcer. Let me share the slide. I think clarifies this from this module. All right, so operant conditioning. Actually, let me do operant conditioning number 2, because the operant conditioning one is the one we just shared. So this is for this, only for this week, this will be your whatever system of belief you may have, your Talmud, your Bible, your Quran, whatever. So please review this, okay? So the first thing I want you to read is the top one. What is a reinforcement? It reinforces, it adds strengths. So increase, maintain behavior. A reinforcement occurs if the behavior increases. A punishment is a decrease in behavior. If you have, now let's go on this, on the y axis. A positive thing adds, So just think of positive as the plus sign, and negative removes it. So don't overthink it. Positive means plus, negative means minus. Okay. Okay. All right. Type 0 negative if you're into Gothic metal. All right. So a positive reinforcement adds a pleasant stimulus to what? To increase or maintain behavior. If I want to increase my studying, I add an A plus. A negative reinforcement removes an adversive stimulus to increase the behavior. So I remove the shame I'll have if I don't get an A, or remove nagging. You know what the best example of this is? One of the best examples, your seat belt, safety belt in the car. If you are in any really car built in the last 10, 15 years, there's a constant beeping sound until you pull your seatbelt on, okay? So you can do something to add a pleasant stimulus to put the seatbelt on, but that will be really hard to obtain. What you're gonna have like every time you put that, you're gonna get a $1 bill that a car will secrete to you. Sure, maybe you can install that device, but it's much easier to add a negative reinforcement. So if you put the seatbelt on, you remove the nasty sound. Think about an alarm if you need to wake up in the morning, okay? Beep, 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 until you wake up and you stop it. The result is the same, okay? You reinforce, you increase the behavior, either by adding good stuff or removing bad stuff, okay? Now let's move on to the pinkish reddish area here. Punishment does not mean negative, simply means removing, decreasing behavior. How do you do that? A positive punishment, again, plus adds an aversive stimulus. The beeping sound is a positive punishment. All right. Removing the aversive stimulus is a negative reinforcement because you are forced to put that seatbelt on. What is a negative punishment? Removes the pleasant stimulus. So let's use the same example for all these 4 quadrants, because this is more like, again, slowing down, taking a deep breath, and see that the same exact action can be viewed from all different perspectives in psychology. And this is very useful, not to necessarily brainwash your partner, although it might be, you know, why not? But to teach children proper behavior, okay? Because children are different, and trying to do the same thing, you know, and it doesn't work, just try to come from a different angle. All right, so the example I want to use is the same one as I used before, speeding, okay, and receiving a ticket. So what would be, I'm going to ask you to share, what would be a positive reinforcement, okay? So the idea is that you're a police officer and you want the person to respect the rules of proper driving style. What will you do for positive reinforcement in order to increase the likelihood that they drive within speed limits? What can you add as a pleasant stimulus?
So in the context of getting pulled over and you're the officer, a warning rather than a ticket that takes away?
Precisely. Yeah, you add a warning. Now you could say, well, wouldn't it be better off without warning? No, that's actually not true in terms of psychological science, what the evidence shows. It's better in terms of to making sure that it happens to be caught and then not experience the full-blown consequence, rather than not being caught at all. Okay. So thank you. That's perfect. Okay. The next one, same situation. What would you do in order to have a negative reinforcement? Remove aversive stimulus to increase or maintain behavior. Very similar situation. Just very tiny twist to it.
Instead of a ticket, a warrant.
Yes,
Instead of yeah, you get
yes.
full on ticket.
The first it's pretty much the same thing. It's like if you had, okay, this is the warning and this is the ticket. Okay, in the
Mhm.
first one, you assume that you already know that police will stop you because you see the lights. Oh, darn it, they caught me, and you just give the warning. In the negative situation, it's like, I could give you a ticket, but I will give you a warning.
Yeah.
Small psychological difference in this situation. Okay. Okay. Okay, let's move to the next one. A positive punishment to decrease behavior. Add aversive stimulus to decrease behavior. This point is pretty straightforward. The ticket, right? I'll give you the ticket this time. Negative punishment. Remove pleasant stimulus. Again, just a slight twist. I give you a ticket. So what am I removing from you?
Money.
Money.
And if you don't pay it, your license.
And you can, exactly, yeah, exactly. So you get the gist of it, okay? It's exactly the same situation coming from different angles. So for instance, I use this one with a purpose because it's very, the difference is right, very minute, very small. But think about, you have a child and I know, extremely successful. My children always listen to me. But you have a child that needs to pick up their toys and finish their meal at night. Okay? I don't hear that anymore, so I suspect my wife operant conditioning skills are extremely good. So what are you gonna do? Are you gonna threaten them by saying, if you don't do this, I will remove TV for 1 week, for instance? Or will you go the opposite way? If you do this, tomorrow you'll get an extra piece of cake. This is just an example, okay? Again, operant conditioning does not tell you which one of these 4 quadrants is the best. Might be different from different people and might be different in different situations. The point is that to provide you with a spectrum of possibilities. So if you try one thing, it doesn't work, you can try a slightly different thing. All right? Wonderful. We are in a very, very good shape tonight. Let me make sure that let me actually take a look at the quiz to make sure that I address everything you should know for the quiz. Again, the chapter goes in a little more depth for what you actually need to know. But that's pretty much it. You know what? Let me, with this last 5 minutes we have, let me just read on page 321 few of the terms that are useful, and there will be kind of repetition. So extinction, it's very similar to what we just said about classic conditioning, just a little twist. Extinction, again, the weakening and eventual disappearance of a learned response, okay, rather than a conditioned stimulus, a small difference. In operant conditioning, it occurs when the response is no longer followed by a reinforcer. So it's exactly the same thing, just different terminology, okay? And again, do not overthink it. Extinction means that something will go away. Pretty straightforward. Stimulus generalization. In operant conditioning, the tendency for a response that has been reinforced in the presence of one stimulus to occur in the presence of similar stimuli. For instance, the example that we were just mentioning here, you get a ticket and you also got your license removed. So similar with the same effect, okay? Or you can have a positive reinforcement, you get a cake and you get a milk as well, okay? Or you can get a cake while watching TV, something like that, okay? Ooh, right? So stimulus generalization. Stimulus discrimination, as you expect, is probably the opposite, right? the tendency of a response to occur in the presence of one stimulus, but not in the presence of similar stimuli that differ from it on some dimension. Example. You got an A+, and the professor comes to you and says, congratulations. Some people might need both reinforcer for their behavior to continue, to decide to continue. For some people, the grade is more important than the professor, because who cares about the professor opinion? In the end, my GPA is what counts. Or the opposite. I really need this emotional connection with people. So numbers are numbers. I want the personal touch to it. Okay. Discriminative stimulus. A stimulus that signals when a particular response is likely to be followed by a certain type of consequence. Maybe I'm not going to study more, but at least I will not party every night. Okay. Now, stimulus realization, discrimination, and discriminative stimulus is not something I will ask you, but I feel they need to just give you an example now. So these three will not be part of the quiz. Now, something I just want to mention here, that again will not be part of the quiz, but it's important for me to at least indicate why that is the case. Continuous and intermittent schedule. Continuous reinforcement, a reinforcement schedule in which a particular response is always reinforced. Intermittent schedule reinforcement, a reinforcement schedule in which a particular response is sometimes, but not always reinforced. This is in itself is everything you need to know about gambling and dating. And I'm not even kidding. It's so incredibly precise the way our, I don't know how to say, our gullible self is prone to make mistakes. Think of gambling. If you would gamble, I'm just thinking about, to give an example, one of those slot machines, okay? If you would win each time, then you might think, well, that will give me more stimulus to keep playing every day. No, it's not true. It will eventually disappear. And it doesn't even have to do anything with how much money you make, although that is part and parcel that you get used to have money. Let me just stop sharing for a second. I'm sure I don't miss any. Thank you, Lilis. That's both stimuli to motivate you more. That's great. So the slot machine, if you would win every time, eventually the pleasure you will take out of getting so much money will disappear completely. Okay. And that's not surprising where you see a lot of people that are extremely rich and they're not happy. So really money, psychologically, does not buy you happiness in the least. Really, it's not true at all. This is not like moralizing or sugarcoating. It just doesn't work. Same as having like a gazillions of partners doesn't make you happy either. It's not the sheer number. The intermittent thing seems to be the one that makes things happen. So you win, you start to get hooked to it, you get addicted to it, and then you just lose everything. And then this doesn't make sense neurologically speaking. The brain's like, well, no, wait a second, I'm supposed to win. So the next time you might say, okay, I'm gonna leave my house, I'm only gonna play $100. That's it, not one penny more. And then by the end of the night, you're bankrupt because it's an intermittent schedule. And this example with gambling, think about dating. And this is so interesting. Granted, this is oversimplifying things in psychology, okay? And I don't mean to be so cynical to the point I'm saying that it's all a question of psychological strategies, pheromones, and neurotransmitters. No, I would love to say that love exists in its own thing. So I do believe in love in that sense. But a person, to give an example, the person that you are somewhat interested in, okay, you might find this person appealing, cute, okay. The first time you express that to the person opens their arms to you, says, yeah, sure, yeah, let's go on a date, yeah, I love you back. Whoa, I like you, it's a little too soon, too quick, okay. I'm not good at practicing what I preach. I say I love you to my wife within 6 days, so don't count me as an expert. But we sit together, so I might be doing something right. But in any case, overall, there is part of the dating system that requires this intermittent schedule of pleasure. Okay, in a sense that first, yes, I smile at you, express interest to you across the table, maybe you're in a club and the person smiles back at you, that's fine. Then you might, spend 10 minutes, you find that you click, but then the person will not call you back right away. It's okay, let's go and hang out every single night. Even if you're really generally interested in this person, that might be just too much to deal with, okay? And so intermittent might mean, to some extent, the kind of the dance of romance, which could also include some mixed messages. One day I might love you, and the day after I might not love you anymore. Okay, I mean, you know what I mean by that. I mean, this kind of intermittent secretion of pleasurable situation and interaction to make the whole situation more interesting, which psychologically speaking is very healthy. This is not to say that you need to play games with the people you're planning to date. You need to be truthful to yourself. But being honest to yourself doesn't mean that you're just gonna either throw yourself at people or simply don't give them a chance. It's a question of a dance, okay? Like in music, you cannot have a great musical piece if all you have is note, 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 note. I'm not sure what happened. Dating is unpredictable, I guess. We just logged off. Not sure.
It's so unpredictable. Zoom crashed.
Yeah, right. I just crashed.
Yeah.
Right. Disconnected at first sight, as they say. So anyway, this is really it in terms of what I'm going to ask you to study for next week. The best way to study is to give yourself examples, because I think I can share this about the quiz. Some of the question will be straightforward and have to do with labeling. What is CR, what is CS? But some of the question will give you scenarios, and they will ask you to interpret which one is what. Okay, so the more you practice and just come up with your own scenarios, the better it's going to be. All right. Now, there are many more labels that we utilize in clinical psychology, especially, that you will never have to learn. But to explain why that is the case, timing is also essential. For instance, in any type of conditioning, especially classical conditioning, the time where you do the conditioning process is as important as the stimulus. For instance, dealing with children, you have, well, I want you to eat this soup, and then you're going to have the cake. Okay, so you present the soup first, and then maybe a second later you show the cake, because if you show the cake first, the child completely forgets everything about the soup. Okay, so it's a question of the timing as well. Now, again, I don't mean any disrespect, please forgive me in advance, but that's an example that is very useful in human relationships, where you don't want to sell yourself short. You don't want to reveal all your secrets all at once, whether you're in a dating scene or whether you're presenting yourself for a job. Okay, it's different if you're having a job interview. You want to display your best possible self, but as you interact, you want to to verify how much of yourself you want to give. Is it strategizing? Well, it's valuing who you are and how much you want to release of the power and the knowledge and the beauty you have with people around you. And that is precisely due to conditioning, intermittent conditioning. Questions any of you may have? Thank you for your attention. That was very good, because it's pretty cut and dry, this part. Next time I will talk about some of the horrors of psychiatric and psychological research that unfortunately were based on classical conditioning. Yeah, just shameful stuff that it's when you hear these horror stories about Nazi experiments in concentration camps that were just plain stupid, pseudoscientific, they kill a lot of people and didn't give a penny of extra knowledge in science. Well, with psychology, it's kind of a gray area. The horrible, the fact that those experiments were horrible is true. In some cases, they did provide some extra knowledge, but not to the point that they could ever be justified. In the sense that a lot of, for instance, if you think about, that gives me chills. If you ever Google Little Albert, an experiment by Watson, it's so immoral. Long story short, the psychologist was telling, this poor child's mother, let's see what happens if you never display any inch of love to your child. Let's see what happens, just like that. Let's be completely cold-hearted, let's see what happens. Now, if your emotions are intact, you know exactly what's going to happen. And in fact, it did happen. And now at least we have the opportunity to say, well, it has been studied. There's a study that shows that. Well, did you really need that? But so we'll talk about those horrors next time, just to not to add too much, at the end of this session. But the idea is this: the good thing about studying conditioning is to have some, I would say some solid evidence of the fact that you need to master, how can I say this? Your light and your darkness. In psychology and in philosophy, there's always this debate. Well, the first one is the nature-nurture debate. We mention this all the time, right? Are we blank slate and then we learn, or do we come into this world with some extra package that we inherit from our parents or genes? But the other question is, are we naturally good or naturally evil? And if we're naturally good, is society that corrupts us? Or if we are naturally evil, it is society that keeps us in check, because otherwise we'll just kill each other. Okay, this is a constant question. And the idea, at least in psychology, is that it's kind of in between. We can be made to make horrible things, but also wonderful things. Yes, go ahead.
I was wondering, are there those in psychology who believe it's one or the other, just simply? Because that astounds me that someone could see it that black and white.
I would say that overall, burnout psychologists tend to believe the first. Early career psychology believe in the latter. So burnout psychologists tend to believe that, we are just messed up. That's it. I tend to disagree fully, but I'm also not. I hope I'm not naive enough, because the risk is this. And I'm not sure if I mentioned it before, but one of the worst advice that I can give as a psychologist is like, well, as long as it feels good, just go with it. I think it's the single most stupid advice I could give to people, because we can make mistakes, the same, and it sounds very judgmental, because a psychologist should also supposed to be a person who understands, who's empathetic, who's welcoming, and thank God for those psychologists. But eventually, there will be salt poured in the wound, and tell you, yes, there are part of yourself that you don't like and you shouldn't like. You need to be extremely careful, because you want to destroy yourself otherwise. And to label those part of yourself as just good will not do you good in the long run. So in that sense, try to, in psychoanalysis, especially in Jungian psychoanalysis, you have a lot of good images. You need to become a dragon slayer, as long as you call the dragon a dragon, not a colorful flower, because it will kill you otherwise. So there's that. Anybody else? All good? Well, I'm enjoying this. Thank you for your attention. I will make sure to post this recording on module 4, week 4. And I just realized that I posted the same video twice last week, so my apologies. On Canvas, you had 2 week 3, so sorry about that. Repetition helps, right? But next week we will continue. So again, what you need to study for next week is chapter 9. Okay, so learning and conditioning. Wonderful. Thank you very much. You all have a good night, if you so choose. So well. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I promise I will reply to those emails I didn't have the chance to get back to yet.
I have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.